The words hit me like ice water on a summer morning. My 7-year-old grandson Tommy stood in my kitchen doorway, his Spider-Man pajamas wrinkled from sleep, tears streaming down his freckled cheeks. "Grandma Ruth, Daddy said you'll be gone soon and we won't see you anymore." His small voice cracked on the last word, and I felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the December wind rattling my windows. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I set down my coffee mug, with trembling hands, and knelt to Tommy's eye level. At 73, my knees protested every movement, but this was more important than physical discomfort. "What exactly did Daddy say, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind raced through possibilities. Tommy wiped his nose on his pajama sleeve, a gesture so achingly familiar that it transported me back 35 years to when his father Marcus had done the exact same thing. "He was on the phone with someone," Tommy whispered, glancing nervously toward the living room where Marcus was presumably still sleeping off whatever had brought him to my house at midnight. "He said Grandma Ruth is getting old and confused, and soon she'll have to go somewhere safe where doctors can take care of her. Then he said something about papers and money, and how everything would be better once you were gone." The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the familiar yellow walls closing in around me. I'd lived in this house for 48 years. Raised Marcus here after his father died in Vietnam. Built a life from the ashes of young widowhood. Every scratch on the hardwood floors told a story. Every photo on the refrigerator marked a milestone. But now my own son was planning to erase me from it all. I pulled Tommy into a hug, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, holding him at arm's length so he could see my face. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm certainly not confused. Sometimes grown-ups say things they don't mean when they're worried or scared. Your daddy loves you very much, and so do I." But even as I spoke the reassuring words, my mind was cataloging recent conversations with Marcus, small changes in his behavior that I'd dismissed as stress from his divorce. The way he'd started asking about my finances, suggesting I might want to simplify my affairs. The concerned looks he'd give me when I forgot a name or misplaced my keys. As if normal aging was evidence of mental decline. The real estate agent who'd called last week, claiming Marcus had asked her to assess my property value for insurance purposes. Tommy nodded against my shoulder, but I could feel his thin frame still shaking. Children have an instinct for danger that adults often lose, and right now every protective instinct I possessed was screaming that something was terribly wrong. My grandson had stumbled into a conversation he shouldn't have heard, and what he'd learned was enough to terrify a child who already felt the world shifting beneath his feet after his parents' bitter divorce. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway as if summoned by our whispered conversation. At 38, he still looked like the earnest boy I'd raised, though stress had carved lines around his eyes and added gray to his dark hair. He was my only child, the center of my universe after his father died, and I'd poured everything I had into making sure he succeeded. Full scholarship to Northwestern, law degree from a prestigious firm, beautiful wife, perfect son. On paper, Marcus had everything a mother could want for her child. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he assessed the scene before him. "Tommy, what are you doing up so early?" "It's Saturday." "I had a bad dream," Tommy said quickly, stepping closer to me. The lie came so easily that I wondered how often he'd learned to protect himself with small deceptions. Children of epindiocras, divorce often become expert at reading adult moods, at saying whatever would keep the peace. Marcus's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, why don't you go watch cartoons while Grandma and I talk?" It wasn't really a suggestion, and Tommy recognized the tone. He gave me one last worried look before padding into the living room, leaving Marcus and me alone in the kitchen that suddenly felt like a battlefield. "He seems upset," I observed, refilling my coffee mug to give my hands something to do. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, a reminder that even in the midst of crisis, life continued in all its mundane beauty. "Kids his age have big imaginations," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from me. "The divorce has been hard on him." Sometimes he mishears things, or makes up stories to get attention. There it was, the subtle implication that Tommy wasn't reliable, that his 7-year-old perception couldn't be trusted. It was the same technique Marcus used in court, I realized, undermining the credibility of witnesses who might contradict his narrative. When had my son learned to manipulate me with the same skills he used on opposing counsel? "What were you talking about on the phone last night?" I asked directly. Tommy seemed to think it was about me. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I was talking to Dr. Harrison about your recent appointment. He's concerned about some of the symptoms you mentioned, the memory issues, the confusion. We were discussing options for additional support. Dr. Harrison was my primary care physician, a kind man in his 60s who'd been treating me for 15 years. During my last checkup, I'd mentioned forgetting where I'd put my reading glasses and struggling to remember the name of my neighbor's new dog. Normal aging concerns that every person my age experienced, but apparently Marcus had interpreted them as signs of cognitive decline. I had a routine physical," I said carefully. "Dr. Harrison said I was in excellent health for my age. When did he call you about symptoms?" "He didn't call me," Marcus admitted, a flush creeping up his neck. "I called him. I'm worried about you, Mom. You're living alone in this big house, managing your finances, making medical decisions. What if something happens? What if you fall and can't get help? What if you forget to take your medications or leave the stove on?" Each question was delivered with genuine-sounding concern, but underneath I heard something else. Impatience, frustration, the tone of someone laying groundwork for a predetermined conclusion. Marcus had already decided I was incompetent. Now he was building a case to prove it. "I managed just fine," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if they were entirely true. Had I been forgetting more things lately? Had the house become too much for me to maintain? Was I clinging to independence out of pride rather than practicality? "Do you?" Marcus leaned forward, his lawyer instincts fully engaged. "When's the last time you balanced your checkbook? Do you remember what medications you're taking? Have you been paying all your bills on time?" The questions stung because they targeted real areas of concern. I had been struggling with the online banking system since the bank discontinued paper statements. The list of medications had grown longer over the years, and sometimes I did forget whether I'd taken the morning pills. Bills that used to be simple were now complicated with automatic payments and electronic notices that confused me. But struggling wasn't the same as incompetent, and I sensed that Marcus was conflating normal aging challenges with serious cognitive decline. More troubling was his eagerness to find evidence of my limitations, as if my independence was an obstacle to overcome rather than something to preserve and support. "Everyone our age has these issues," I said. "Mrs. Patterson next door is 81 and still drives herself to the grocery store. Mr. Chen across the street is 79 and just finished renovating."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
His bathroom. Getting older doesn't mean becoming helpless. "Mrs. Patterson fell last month and broke her hip," Marcus countered. "Mr. Chen's son had to take over his finances after he nearly got scammed by phone solicitors. These aren't just normal aging issues, Mom. They're warning signs." I stared at my son across the kitchen table, seeing a stranger wearing Marcus's face. When had he become so calculating, so ready to diminish my autonomy for what he claimed was my own good? The boy I'd raised had been compassionate, protective without being controlling. This man spoke like someone who'd already made up his mind and was simply going through the motions of consultation. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. Marcus pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what looked like saved notes. "I've been researching assisted living facilities. There are some beautiful places in the area, really nice communities with activities and medical support. You'd have your own apartment, but there'd be people around to help with things like medication management and meal preparation." Assisted living. The phrase hung in the air between us, like a death sentence. I'd visited friends in similar facilities, watched them slowly lose pieces of themselves as institutional routine replaced personal choice. They called it independent living, but the independence was carefully circumscribed. limited to approved activities within approved spaces, under approved supervision. I don't need assisted living, I said firmly. I need my home, my garden, my neighborhood. I need to wake up in the room I shared with your father, to drink coffee in the kitchen where I taught you to tie your shoes, to sit on the porch where we watched you learn to ride a bicycle. Mom, you're being emotional about this, Marcus said, his voice taking on the patient tone adults use with unreasonable children. I understand the house has sentimental value, but it's not practical anymore. The stairs are dangerous, the maintenance is overwhelming, and you're isolated out here. What happens when you can't drive anymore? What happens if you have a medical emergency? Each argument was reasonable on its surface, but together they painted a picture of inevitable decline and helplessness that felt foreign to my experience. Yes, the stairs were steeper than they used to be, but I climbed them every day without incident. Yes, the house required maintenance, but I had reliable contractors and enough money to pay for necessary repairs. Yes, I lived alone, but I had neighbors who checked on me and friends who called regularly. Marcus was describing a version of my life that emphasized limitations and ignored strengths, that focused on potential problems rather than current capabilities. It was the kind of selective presentation that made terrible decisions seem reasonable and necessary. Have you already picked out a facility? I asked, though something in his prepared arguments suggested he'd moved well beyond the research phase. There's a place called Sunset Manor about 20 minutes from here, he said, pulling up photos on his phone. They have an opening in their memory care unit, and the director said they could hold it for us for a few weeks while we get the paperwork together. Memory care unit. The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just talking about assisted living. He was talking about the locked ward, where they housed people with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. People who wandered off or forgot their own names or became dangerous to themselves and others. I don't have dementia, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Dr. Harrison never suggested anything like memory care. You're talking about treating me like I'm mentally incompetent based on forgetting where I put my glasses. It's not just the glasses, Mom, Marcus said, his tone becoming more urgent. You called me 3 times last week asking the same question about Tommy's school schedule. You got lost driving to the pharmacy you've been going to for 15 years. Yesterday, you left the garage door open all night. Each accusation landed with the weight of truth, but also with the sting of selective interpretation. Yes, I'd called about Tommy's schedule, but that was because it had changed due to teacher conferences, and I wanted to make sure I had the right pickup time. Yes, I'd taken a wrong turn going to the pharmacy, but that was because they were doing construction on my usual route. Yes, I'd left the garage door open, but that was because I'd been distracted by a phone call from my sister about her husband's surgery results. Marcus was taking normal human mistakes and reframing them as symptoms of cognitive decline. More disturbing was his detailed catalog of my supposed failures, as if he'd been keeping a running list of evidence to support his predetermined conclusion. You've been watching me, I said, the realization settling over me like a cold fog. Keeping track of every mistake, every moment of confusion. How long have you been building a case against me? I've been concerned about you, Marcus insisted, but his eyes couldn't quite meet mine. These incidents are becoming more frequent, and the consequences are getting more serious. What if you'd left the stove on instead of the garage door? What if you'd gotten lost somewhere dangerous instead of just taking a wrong turn? The what-ifs were endless, each one designed to transform ordinary mistakes into evidence of dangerous incompetence. By Marcus's logic, anyone who'd ever forgotten an appointment or misplaced their keys was a candidate for memory care. It was a standard that would institutionalize half the population over 60. But I was beginning to understand that logic and fairness weren't really the point. Marcus had decided I needed to be removed from my home, and he was constructing whatever narrative necessary to justify that decision. The question was why? What did he gain from having me declared incompetent and locked away in a memory care facility? The answer came to me with sickening clarity as I remembered Tommy's frightened words. Daddy said something about papers and money and how everything would be better once you were gone. Marcus wasn't just planning to institutionalize me. He was planning to take control of my assets. The house, the investments, the life insurance policies. Everything I'd spent decades building would transfer to him once I was declared mentally incompetent. "Who's helping you with this?" I asked, watching his face carefully. "The paperwork for involuntary commitment, the medical evaluations, the legal guardianship. You can't do all of that alone." Marcus's expression shuddered, becoming the blank professional mask he wore in court. "I don't know what you're implying, but I'm trying to help you. Everything I'm doing is for your own good and Tommy's future security." Tommy's future security. There it was, the justification that made everything else palatable. Marcus could tell himself he wasn't stealing from his elderly mother. He was protecting his son's inheritance. He could frame institutionalizing me as a noble sacrifice, ensuring that Tommy would have financial stability even if it meant sacrificing my autonomy and dignity. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall, the same clock that had marked the hours of Marcus's childhood, that had counted down the minutes until his father came home from work each evening. I'd wound that clock every Sunday for 40 years, a small ritual that connected past to present to future. Now I wondered if I'd be around to wind it much longer. From the living room came the sound of cartoon voices and Tommy's occasional giggle, reminders that innocent life continued, even as adult manipulations unfolded in the next room. My grandson was watching Saturday morning cartoons, unaware that his father was planning to erase his grandmother from his life under the guise of medical necessity. "I need time to think about this," I said finally, standing up from the table with more confidence than I felt. "These are big decisions and I won't be rushed into anything." "Of course," Marcus said, but something in his tone suggested that my thinking time was more limited than I might hope. "Just don't wait too long, Mom. The opening at Sunset Manor won't be available indefinitely, and winter's coming. If you fall on the ice or have some other emergency, our options might become much more limited." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Marcus was creating urgency around a manufactured crisis, pressuring me to make a decision that would benefit him, while claiming to act in my best interests. It was emotional manipulation wrapped in filial concern, and it was terrifyingly effective. After Marcus and Tommy left, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the empty coffee mugs and trying to process what I'd learned. My son, the child I'd sacrificed everything to raise and educate, was planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could control my assets. He'd been documenting my normal aging mistakes as evidence of dementia, researching facilities to house me against my will, and apparently discussing timelines with unnamed collaborators. But the most chilling part was how reasonable he'd made it all sound. Every argument was logical, every concern was valid, every solution was presented as being in my best interest. If I hadn't overheard Tommy's innocent revelation, I might have started questioning my own competence, wondering if Marcus was right about my declining abilities. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister Margaret in Phoenix and told her everything. Margaret was 5 years older than me, sharp as ever at 78, and possessed of the kind of practical wisdom that comes from raising 6 children and burying 2 husbands. "That son of a bitch," she said when I finished my account, her language more colorful than usual. "Ruth, honey, you're dealing with a con artist who happens to share your DNA. The fact that he's your son doesn't make what he's doing any less criminal." "But what if he's right?" I asked, voicing the doubt that had been gnawing at me all day. "What if I am losing my abilities and just can't see it? What if I am becoming a danger to myself?" Margaret snorted, a sound I remembered from our childhood when she'd encountered something particularly stupid. "Ruthie, you organized my husband's entire funeral from 2,000 miles away, coordinated with 3 different churches, managed the flowers and catering, and kept track of 47 relatives, travel arrangements. That was 6 months ago. Does that sound like someone with dementia to you?" She was right, and the memory gave me strength. I had handled complex situations recently, made important decisions, managed my own affairs successfully. Marcus was cherry-picking incidents to support his narrative while ignoring abundant evidence of my continued competence. "What do I do?" I asked, feeling more helpless than I had since the early days of widowhood. "First, you document everything," Margaret said in her best take-charge voice. "Every conversation, every incident he claims as evidence, every person he's talked to about this plan. Then you get yourself a lawyer. And not just any lawyer. You need someone who specializes in elder abuse. 'Cause that's exactly what this is. Elder abuse. The term felt foreign applied to my situation, but Margaret was right. Marcus was using his position as my son, my trust in his intentions and societal assumptions about aging, to manipulate me into giving up my rights and assets. The fact that he genuinely might believe he was acting in my best interest didn't make it less abusive. That evening, I did something else I hadn't done in years. I went through every drawer, every file cabinet, every important paper in my house. I found my will, which left everything to Marcus and Tommy. I found insurance policies, investment accounts, property deeds, and bank statements. I found 48 years of careful financial management, evidence of a woman who'd turned a modest survivor's pension into substantial wealth through prudent decisions and hard work. I also found something else. Tucked into the back of my jewelry box was a business card for Patricia Valdez, attorney at law, elder rights advocacy. I'd met Patricia at a library lecture series about estate planning 2 years ago, and she'd given me her card with the comment that too many older adults waited until crisis hit before seeking legal advice. The next morning, I called Patricia's office. When I explained my situation to her assistant, I was given an appointment for that afternoon. Patricia turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every variation of family dysfunction imaginable. "Tell me everything," she said, settling back in her chair with a legal pad. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave out anything that seems embarrassing or trivial. In cases like this, the details matter." I told her about Tommy's frightened confession, Marcus's sudden concern about my competence, his research into memory care facilities, and his catalog of my supposed failures. I told her about the real estate agent's call, the conversations with Dr. Harrison that had apparently never happened, and the sense that I was being watched and evaluated by my own son. Patricia took notes throughout my account, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting specific dates. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and determination. "Mrs. Chen," she said, using my married name with deliberate formality, "what you're describing is a textbook case of financial exploitation with attempted guardianship abuse. Your son is laying the groundwork to have you declared incapacitated so he can gain control of your assets and decisions. But what if I really am losing my abilities?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me since yesterday's revelation. "Then we'll deal with that if and when it becomes a real issue," Patricia said firmly. "But based on everything you've told me, you're a competent adult who's experiencing normal age-related changes. The fact that you're here, able to articulate your concerns clearly and provide detailed chronological accounts of events, tells me your cognitive abilities are intact." She opened a thick folder and began pulling out documents. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to get you a comprehensive cognitive evaluation from a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in capacity assessments. This will give us baseline documentation of your actual mental state, not your son's interpretation of isolated incidents. Second, we're going to revise your estate planning documents to include safeguards against coercive transfers. If someone is pressuring you to change your will or give up control of your assets, there will be legal protections in place. Third, we're going to set up monitoring systems for your financial accounts. Any large or unusual transactions will require additional verification, making it harder for someone to manipulate you into transferring money or property. And finally," Patricia said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "we're going to put your son on notice that his behavior is being documented, and that any attempt to pursue guardianship or institutionalization will be met with aggressive legal resistance." The relief I felt was overwhelming. For the first time since Tommy's frightened confession, I felt like I had some control over my situation. Patricia was treating me like a competent adult whose rights and autonomy mattered, not like a confused elderly woman who needed protection from her own poor judgment. Over the next week, Patricia's plan began to take shape. The cognitive evaluation confirmed what I already knew. My mental abilities were within normal limits for my age, with no signs of dementia or significant cognitive impairment. The doctor noted that I showed some signs of stress and anxiety, which was hardly surprising given my son's recent behavior, but concluded that I was fully capable of making my own decisions about medical care, finances, and living arrangements. The revised estate planning documents were more complex, but they essentially created multiple barriers to coercion. Any changes to major bequests would require confirmation from two independent parties. Any transfer of property or significant assets would trigger waiting periods and additional oversight. If someone attempted to have me declared incompetent, the burden of proof would be much higher, and I would have automatic access to independent legal representation. The financial monitoring system was perhaps the most important safeguard. Patricia had seen too many cases where elderly parents were gradually separated from their money through small, seemingly reasonable requests that escalated over time. Now, any attempt to access my accounts or change my financial arrangements would leave a clear paper trail and require multiple forms of verification. But the most crucial step was the letter Patricia sent to Marcus at his law office. Written in formal legal language, it informed him that his mother was represented by counsel in all matters related to her capacity, finances, and living arrangements. It noted that any attempt to pursue guardianship or involuntary commitment would be vigorously contested, and that his documented statements about her supposed incompetence could constitute elder abuse under state law. The letter was delivered on a Tuesday morning. Marcus called me that afternoon, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mom, what the hell is this?" he demanded, apparently deciding that subtlety was no longer necessary. "You hired a lawyer? You're treating me like some kind of criminal when all I'm trying to do is help you." "I hired a lawyer to protect my rights," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "The same rights you were planning to take away by having me declared incompetent." "I never said you were incompetent," Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I said you needed support, supervision, help with daily tasks. There's a difference." "Is there? Because the memory care facility you researched doesn't allow residents to leave without permission. The guardianship papers you were discussing would give you control over my medical decisions, my finances, and my living arrangements." "That sounds like declaring me incompetent to me." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had shifted to the cold, professional tone he used when a case wasn't going his way. "You're making a mistake, Mom. You're letting some lawyer fill your head with paranoid fantasies instead of accepting help from people who actually care about you. When you fall down those stairs or forget to take your medication or get swindled by some con artist, don't come crying to me." "I won't," I said, and meant it. "But Marcus, when you realize that your son deserves better than a father who would betray his own mother for money, don't come crying to me either." This time he did hang up, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the phone buzzing in my hand and my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I'd just declared war on my own son, and I had no idea what he might do in retaliation. The answer came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, I received a certified letter informing me that Marcus was filing for emergency guardianship based on my recent erratic behavior and poor judgment, including my decision to hire a lawyer to interfere with necessary medical care. According to the petition, I was a danger to myself and others, and immediate intervention was required to protect my well-being and assets. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving me less than a week to prepare my defense. Patricia was furious, but not surprised. "This is exactly what abusers do when their victims start fighting back," she explained. "They escalate the pressure and try to rush through legal proceedings before anyone can mount an effective defense." But Patricia had been expecting this move, and she was ready. Over the weekend, we assembled a comprehensive response that included my recent cognitive evaluation, statements from my doctor confirming my mental competency, financial records showing responsible money management, and testimonials from neighbors and friends about my continued independence and clear thinking. Most importantly, we had Tommy. Patricia had explained that in guardianship cases, courts sometimes interviewed family members to understand the family dynamics at play. She'd suggested that I might want to have someone talk to Tommy about what he'd overheard, not to coach him or put words in his mouth, but to understand what he actually knew about his father's plans. What we learned was heartbreaking and illuminating. Tommy had overheard not just one phone conversation, but several. He knew that his father was planning to put Grandma somewhere safe, and that this would mean selling her house and using the money for better things. He knew that his father had been keeping a list of times when I seemed, quote, confused or forgetful. Most devastating of all, He knew that his father had told someone that once I was taken care of, there would be enough money to solve all their problems. Out of the mouths of babes came the truth Marcus had tried so hard to disguise. This wasn't about my well-being or safety. It was about accessing my assets to solve his financial problems. The divorce had apparently been more expensive than I'd realized, and Marcus was looking at his mother's estate as a solution to his cash flow issues. The guardianship hearing took place in a small courtroom that smelled of old wood and anxiety. Marcus sat at one table with a lawyer I didn't recognize, while Patricia and I occupied the other. The judge was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a reputation for being skeptical of family members seeking guardianship over competent relatives. Marcus's lawyer presented their case first, painting a picture of a confused elderly woman whose judgment had become dangerously impaired. They cited my erratic behavior in hiring a lawyer, my paranoid suspicions about my son's motives, and my stubborn refusal to accept necessary help with daily living tasks. But when Patricia cross-examined the witnesses Marcus had brought to testify about my supposed incompetence, their testimony fell apart under scrutiny. The neighbor who claimed I'd seemed confused during a recent conversation admitted under questioning that I'd been dealing with a complex insurance matter and had handled it successfully. The family friend who said I'd appeared overwhelmed by simple decisions acknowledged that this was during the week after I'd learned about Marcus's plans, when anyone might have seemed stressed. Most damaging to Marcus's case was Dr. Harrison's testimony. Patricia had subpoenaed him after discovering that Marcus had been misrepresenting their conversations. Dr. Harrison confirmed that while Marcus had called to express concerns about my mental state, the doctor's own examination had found no evidence of cognitive impairment. He'd never recommended memory care or suggested that I was incompetent to make my own decisions. When it was our turn to present evidence, Patricia methodically dismantled every element of Marcus's case. She showed financial records proving my continued competent money management, including recent successful negotiations with contractors and investment decisions that had actually increased my portfolio value. She presented my cognitive evaluation results, which placed me well within normal limits for my age group. She called neighbors and friends who testified to my continued independence and clear thinking. But the most powerful moment came when the judge asked to interview Tommy privately. Despite Marcus's objections, the court appointed a child advocate to speak with my grandson about the family situation. What Tommy told the advocate and what the advocate later shared with the court confirmed everything Patricia and I had suspected. Tommy had overheard multiple conversations about plans to, quote, get rid of Grandma so that his father could fix everything with the money from selling her house. He'd heard his father practicing what he would say to doctors and lawyers to convince them that I was too old and crazy to live alone. Most tellingly, he'd heard his father telling someone on the phone that once I was in the memory care facility, the old lady won't be able to cause any more problems. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. She found no credible evidence that I lacked the capacity to make my own decisions about medical care, finances, or living arrangements. She noted that the petitioner's motives appeared to be financial rather than protective, and that attempting to institutionalize a competent adult against their will constituted a form of abuse. Marcus's petition for guardianship was denied, and the court issued a restraining order preventing him from making any further attempts to interfere with my autonomy without clear medical evidence of incapacity. As we left the courtroom, Marcus grabbed my arm in the hallway. His face was flushed with anger and something that might have been desperation. "You think you've won something here, but you're just postponing the inevitable," he hissed. "You're going to get hurt living alone, and when you do, Tommy's going to suffer because his inheritance will be eaten up by medical bills and nursing home costs." I pulled my arm free and looked at the man I'd raised, searching for some trace of the compassionate child he'd once been. "Tommy's real inheritance is supposed to be the knowledge that his family loves him and protects him," I said. "Not money stolen from someone who trusted you. If you can't see the difference, then maybe you're the one who needs help." The months that followed were difficult in ways I hadn't expected. Marcus cut off all contact between Tommy and me, claiming that my vindictive behavior in court proved I was a bad influence on his son. I received occasional reports through mutual friends that Marcus was struggling financially and had been forced to take on additional cases to make ends meet. The easy money he'd expected from controlling my assets was no longer available, and he was having to work for his income like everyone else. But there were positive changes too. Patricia had connected me with a network of other seniors who'd faced similar situations with adult children or other relatives seeking to exploit them. I learned that my experience was far from unique, and that the legal protections we'd put in place were helping other elderly adults maintain their independence and dignity. I also discovered resources I hadn't known existed. A local senior center offered classes in financial management and legal rights for older adults. The county health department provided free home safety assessments that addressed real concerns about aging in place without requiring institutional care. A volunteer program connected me with college students who could help with technology issues and online banking in exchange for tutoring and life skills their parents had never taught them. Most importantly, I began to rebuild relationships that Marcus's manipulation had damaged. Several friends admitted they'd been concerned about me after Marcus had spoken to them about my supposed cognitive decline, but seeing me advocate effectively for myself had convinced them that his portrayal had been inaccurate. Family members who'd been keeping their distance out of awkwardness about my situation began calling and visiting again once they realized there was no situation beyond normal aging. The real test came 8 months later, when I had what Marcus would probably have called a perfect example of why I needed supervision. I fell while gardening, twisted my ankle badly, and couldn't get up without help. Mrs. Patterson next door heard me call for assistance and came running with her portable phone to call for medical help. Within minutes, I had paramedics assessing my injury, neighbors checking on my well-being, and a clear plan for recovery that would allow me to remain in my own home. What Marcus would have seen as proof of dangerous incompetence, I saw as evidence that communities could support aging adults without stripping them of their autonomy. Yes, I'd fallen and needed help, but the help came from people who respected my right to make my own decisions about treatment and recovery. The paramedics explained my options and let me choose whether to go to the hospital. My neighbors offered assistance with daily tasks while respecting my desire to remain independent. My doctor worked with me to develop a physical therapy plan that addressed my limitations without assuming I was incapable of managing my own care. The ankle healed completely, and I was back to my normal activities within 6 weeks. But more importantly, I'd proven to myself that aging didn't have to mean surrendering control over my life to people who claimed to know what was best for me. It was during my recovery that I got an unexpected phone call. Tommy's voice was older, more serious than I remembered, but still unmistakably my grandson. "Grandma Ruth?" he said hesitantly. "It's Tommy. I'm calling from my friend's house because Dad doesn't know." My heart clenched at the secrecy in his voice, at the fact that my grandson had to sneak around to talk to his grandmother. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, settling into my kitchen chair with the phone pressed tight against my ear. "I've missed you so much." "I miss you too," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "Grandma, I know what Dad tried to do to you was wrong. I heard him talking to his lawyer about how he was going to get your money and your house, and I know that's not what family is supposed to do." The maturity in his voice broke my heart. At 8 years old, Tommy shouldn't have needed to understand the complexities of financial manipulation and family betrayal. But his father's actions had forced him into an adult world of secrets and moral compromises. "Tommy, none of this is your fault," I said, wishing I could reach through the phone and hold him. "And you don't need to worry about grown-up problems like money and houses. That's not your responsibility." "But it is my fault, kind of," he insisted with the logic of childhood guilt. "If Dad hadn't needed money for my school and stuff after the divorce, maybe he wouldn't have tried to take yours. And now I can't see you anymore because he says you're dangerous and mean, but I know that's not true." The pain in his voice was unbearable. Marcus had not only tried to steal my autonomy and assets, he'd stolen my relationship with my grandson and burdened an 8-year-old with guilt over adult decisions he couldn't control or understand. It was perhaps the cruelest consequence of his scheme. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, using the same tone I'd used when he was smaller and needed reassurance after nightmares. "Your father's choices are his responsibility, not yours. The problems he has with money or anything else existed long before you were born, and they have nothing to do with what kind of child you are or what you need. Good parents find ways to provide for their children without hurting other people, especially their own mothers. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this adult truth that his father should have protected him from learning. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Anything, sweetheart." "When I grow up and have kids, will I turn out like Dad? Will I try to hurt people to get what I want?" The question devastated me because it revealed how deeply Marcus's behavior had shaken Tommy's sense of security about his own future. Children typically assume they'll be like their parents. And now Tommy was terrified that he might inherit his father's capacity for betrayal. "No, baby, you won't," I said with absolute certainty. "Do you know how I know that?" "How?" "Because you're already asking the right questions. You already know that what your father did was wrong, and you already feel bad about people getting hurt. Those feelings, that moral compass inside you, that's what will keep you from making the same mistakes. Your father lost his way somewhere along the line, but you're starting from a different place." We talked for another 20 minutes about school and friends and his new interest in building model airplanes. Normal grandmother-grandson conversation that felt precious after months of separation. When he finally had to hang up before Marcus came home, Tommy made me promise to keep our conversation secret. "I don't want Dad to get madder at you," he explained, "and I don't want him to take my friend's phone away for letting me call." The fact that my 8-year-old grandson was managing family secrets and protecting me from his father's anger was another indictment of Marcus's behavior. Children shouldn't have to shield grandparents from their own parents, shouldn't have to sneak around to maintain family relationships, shouldn't have to choose sides in adult conflicts they didn't create. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about the long-term damage Marcus had inflicted. Even if he eventually allowed contact between Tommy and me, even if our relationship could be repaired, my grandson would always carry the knowledge that his father had tried to betray his grandmother for money. That kind of disillusionment changes a child's understanding of trust and family loyalty in ways that can never be completely undone. 2 weeks later, I received another unexpected call, this time from someone I hadn't heard from in over a year. Sandra Morrison was the daughter of Patricia Morrison, the Oregon vineyard owner who'd been one of Julian's previous victims in the story that had inspired my own legal protections. Patricia had reached out to warn me that she'd heard through legal networks about my situation and wanted to offer support. "Mrs. Chen," Sandra said, her voice warm but serious. "I wanted to call because my mother and I went through something very similar with someone who tried to manipulate our family business situation. Patricia Valdez gave us your number and said you might benefit from talking to someone who'd been through the guardianship process from the other side." It turned out that Sandra's experience had been even more traumatic than mine. Her mother's second husband had actually succeeded in having Patricia declared incompetent for a brief period, during which he'd managed to sell off part of the vineyard and transfer significant assets to accounts he controlled. It had taken 6 months of legal battles and tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees to reverse the guardianship and restore Patricia's rights. "The worst part wasn't the money," Sandra explained. "It was watching my mother doubt herself. This man had convinced her that she really was losing her mind, that her confusion and memory problems were worse than they actually were. Even after we proved he'd been lying and manipulating the situation, it took her months to trust her own judgment again." This was exactly what Marcus had been trying to do to me, I realized. The constant questioning of my competence, the catalog of my mistakes, the suggestions that I was too confused to manage my own affairs. It was all designed to undermine my confidence in my own abilities. If Tommy hadn't overheard that phone conversation, if I hadn't learned about Marcus's true motives, I might have eventually started believing that I really did need the kind of help he was offering. "How is your mother doing now?" I asked. "Much better, but it changed her. She's more suspicious of people's motives now, more protective of her independence. In some ways that's probably healthy, but she lost some of the trusting, generous spirit that made her who she was. That's what makes me angriest about the whole thing. Not just what he tried to take from her financially, but what he did take from her emotionally." Sandra's words resonated deeply because I could see the same changes happening in myself. I was more guarded now, more analytical of people's actions and motivations. When friends offered help with tasks or expressed concern about my well-being, I found myself wondering if they had ulterior motives. When service providers suggested upgrades or changes to my home systems, I questioned whether they were trying to take advantage of my age. It was an exhausting way to live, but Marcus's betrayal had taught me that even family members couldn't always be trusted. The conversation with Sandra led to my involvement with a support group for seniors who'd experienced financial or emotional abuse from family members. What I learned there was both disturbing and validating. My experience with Marcus was part of a much larger pattern of adult children exploiting elderly parents, and the problem was growing as the population aged and family structures became more strained. Margaret, a 76-year-old retired teacher, shared how her son had gradually taken over her finances by claiming he was helping her manage complex investments. By the time she realized what was happening, he'd transferred most of her retirement savings to accounts she couldn't access and was using her money to fund his failed business ventures. Robert, an 82-year-old widower, described how his daughter had moved into his house after his wife died, ostensibly to provide companionship and assistance. Within 6 months, she'd convinced him to add her name to the deed and had begun making plans to sell the property and move him into a facility so she could keep the proceeds. Frank, a 79-year-old veteran, had been pressured by his son to sign power of attorney documents that gave the son control over all financial decisions. The son had then systematically liquidated Frank's assets, including selling his car and canceling his insurance policies, while claiming these were necessary cost-saving measures. Each story followed a similar pattern. Adult children identifying elderly parents as financial opportunities, gradually increasing control over their lives while claiming to act in their best interests, and ultimately attempting to transfer assets or decision-making authority to themselves. The victims were typically isolated from other family members or friends who might have questioned the arrangements, and their normal aging-related concerns were amplified and reframed as evidence of incompetence. What struck me most about these stories was how reasonable the adult children's arguments always sounded on the surface. They weren't obviously villainous people demanding money from helpless seniors. They were concerned sons and daughters who worried about their parents' safety, who wanted to help with complex financial decisions, who believed that institutional care might be more appropriate than independent living. Their manipulation was subtle and emotionally sophisticated, designed to make the victims feel grateful for the help they were receiving. The support group became an important part of my healing process, but it also opened my eyes to the broader social forces that enabled this kind of abuse. Ageism in medical and legal systems meant that elderly adults' complaints about family members were often dismissed as confusion or paranoia. Financial institutions had few safeguards to prevent family members from pressuring seniors into making transfers or changes to accounts. Legal guardianship processes were designed to be quick and efficient, which made them vulnerable to manipulation by people who knew how to present compelling cases for incompetence. Most troubling was the cultural narrative that treated aging as inevitable decline toward helplessness. Society expected elderly people to gradually surrender their autonomy to younger family members, and questioned the judgment of seniors who resisted this process. My insistence on maintaining control over my own life was seen by some as stubbornness, rather than appropriate self-advocacy. These systemic problems meant that my victory over Marcus was somewhat hollow. Yes, I'd protected my own rights and assets, but countless other seniors were facing similar threats, without the resources or support systems I'd been lucky enough to access. Patricia Valdez had become something of a crusader on this issue, but she was just one lawyer trying to address a problem that affected millions of older adults. 6 months after the guardianship hearing, I made a decision that surprised even me. I began volunteering with Patricia's practice, helping other seniors understand their rights and recognize warning signs of family financial abuse. My age and experience as a victim gave me credibility with people who might have been skeptical of younger advocates or legal professionals who hadn't lived through similar situations. The work was both rewarding and heartbreaking. I met with dozens of older adults who were being pressured by family members to make financial decisions that didn't serve their interests. Some cases were as blatant as Marcus's attempted guardianship scheme, but others involved more subtle forms of coercion that were harder to identify and address. Eleanor, an 84-year-old widow, was being pressured by her daughter to sell her condominium and move in with the daughter's family. On the surface, this seemed like a reasonable arrangement that would provide companionship and reduce Eleanor's living expenses. But further investigation revealed that the daughter was planning to use the proceeds from the condo sale to pay off her own mortgage, leaving Eleanor financially dependent and without options if the living arrangement didn't work out. James, a 77-year-old retired engineer, had been convinced by his nephew to invest his life savings in a revolutionary technology startup that existed primarily on paper. The nephew had used family connections and technical jargon to make the investment seem both lucrative and safe, but James's money was essentially gone, transferred to accounts the nephew controlled with no realistic prospect of return. Maria, a 71-year-old grandmother, had signed over power of attorney to her son during a hospitalization for pneumonia. The son had assured her it was a temporary measure to help with medical decisions while she recovered, but he'd continued to use the authority months later to control her finances and living arrangements in ways that served his interests rather than hers. Each case required different strategies and interventions, but they all shared common elements of family members exploiting trust and leveraging age-related vulnerabilities for personal gain. Working with these victims helped me understand how lucky I'd been to discover Marcus's true motives before he could implement his plans fully. It also helped me process my own anger and grief about what Marcus had tried to do. Helping other seniors protect themselves and their assets gave meaning to my own traumatic experience and transformed me from a victim into an advocate. The skills I had learned defending myself became tools I could use to help others in similar situations. But the work also forced me to confront the ongoing reality of my fractured relationship with Marcus and my separation from Tommy. While I was helping other families navigate similar crises, my own family remained broken by the choices Marcus had made. The professional satisfaction of advocacy work couldn't entirely compensate for the personal loss of my son and grandson. That reality came into sharp focus during the holiday season, my first Christmas without Tommy since he was born. I'd always been the grandmother who hosted elaborate holiday celebrations, who baked cookies and told stories and created magical memories for my grandson. Now I spent Christmas Day alone, volunteering at a community dinner for seniors who had nowhere else to go. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was surrounded by other elderly people whose families had failed them in various ways, while my own family situation remained unresolved. I could help strangers protect their relationships and assets, but I couldn't fix the damage Marcus had done to our family bonds. It was during that lonely holiday season that I received another unexpected call, this time from Marcus's ex-wife, Jennifer. We'd maintained a cordial relationship during their marriage, but contact had been minimal since the divorce. Her voice was hesitant, almost nervous, as she explained why she was calling. "Ruth, I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I've been thinking about everything that happened last year with the guardianship situation. I wanted you to know that I never supported Marcus's plans, and I'm sorry I didn't speak up more strongly at the time." Jennifer went on to explain that she'd been dealing with her own legal and financial challenges during the divorce and hadn't fully understood the scope of what Marcus was attempting until after the court hearing. She'd heard through mutual acquaintances about the outcome and had gradually pieced together the full story of Marcus's manipulation and my successful defense. "The thing is," she continued, "Tommy has been asking about you constantly. He knows he's not supposed to talk about you around his father, but he tells me about missing you every time he's at my house. He's been having nightmares and behavioral problems at school, and I think part of it is the stress of being cut off from you." This confirmation of Tommy's distress was both heartbreaking and validating. I'd suspected that Marcus's decision to eliminate contact between Tommy and me was harming my grandson, but hearing it from his mother made the situation feel more urgent and real. "I've been thinking about what's best for Tommy," Jennifer said, "and I don't think isolating him from you serves his interests. I know Marcus would be furious if he knew I was calling you, but I'm Tommy's mother too, and I have a right to make decisions about his well-being." What Jennifer proposed was both simple and revolutionary. During her custody time with Tommy, she would facilitate contact between him and me. Marcus wouldn't be informed about these visits or communications, at least initially, but Tommy would be able to maintain a relationship with his grandmother without having to sneak around or feel guilty about it. The arrangement felt risky for everyone involved. Jennifer was potentially violating her custody agreement by going against Marcus's wishes about family contact. I was potentially exposing myself to renewed conflict with Marcus if he discovered what we were doing. Tommy would still be caught between his parents, conflicting approaches to our family situation. But the alternative was allowing Marcus's anger and greed to permanently destroy Tommy's relationship with his grandmother, and none of us thought that served Tommy's best interests. Children needed their extended family relationships, especially during times of family crisis and transition. Cutting Tommy off from me wasn't protecting him. It was punishing him for his father's mistakes. Our first visit was arranged for a Saturday afternoon when Tommy was supposed to be at a birthday party that Jennifer would attend with him. Instead, she brought him to my house for 2 hours of grandmother-grandson time that felt both natural and precious. Tommy had grown noticeably in the months since I'd seen him, but he still ran into my arms like the little boy he'd always been with me. We spent the afternoon doing ordinary things that felt extraordinary after so much separation. We baked cookies using the recipe his grandfather had loved, worked on a jigsaw puzzle of a lighthouse, and played board games that tested his improving reading skills. Tommy told me about school and friends and his new interest in dinosaurs, while I listened with the focused attention that grandparents can give when they're not responsible for daily discipline and scheduling. But underneath the normalcy was an awareness that our time was limited and secret, that Tommy couldn't tell his father about our visit, that we were all taking risks to maintain a relationship that should have been natural and protected. The joy of reconnecting was tempered by the knowledge that we were operating in defiance of Marcus's wishes and potentially creating future conflicts. "Grandma," Tommy said as we worked on the puzzle, "I don't understand why Dad doesn't want me to see you anymore. You're not mean or dangerous like he says. You're just Grandma." The simplicity of his observation highlighted the absurdity of Marcus's position. I wasn't a threat to Tommy's safety or well-being. I was his grandmother who loved him and wanted to be part of his life. Marcus's decision to cut off contact was punitive rather than protective, designed to hurt me rather than help Tommy. Sometimes adults make decisions based on their hurt feelings rather than what's best for children, I explained, trying to be honest without undermining his relationship with his father. "Your dad is angry with me about the grown-up problems we had, and he's letting that anger affect his decisions about our family. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love you, and it doesn't mean our relationship has to end forever." Tommy nodded with the serious expression he got when processing complex adult emotions. "Mom says maybe someday Dad will stop being so angry and we can all be a family again. Do you think that's true?" I wanted to give him hope, but I also didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep. Marcus's behavior during the guardianship crisis had revealed aspects of his character that troubled me deeply, and I wasn't sure he could or would change enough to repair our relationship. But Tommy needed to believe in the possibility of family healing, even if the adults involved weren't sure it was realistic. "I think your mom is wise to hope for that," I said carefully. "People can change and grow, and families can heal from serious problems if everyone is willing to work at it. I hope someday your dad and I can find a way to solve our differences that doesn't hurt you or other people we love." Our visits continued on an irregular basis over the following months, scheduled around Jennifer's custody time and Tommy's other activities. Each one felt like a gift, a chance to maintain the grandmother-grandson bond that Marcus had tried to sever. Tommy began to relax during these visits, stopped checking the time nervously, or asking if his father might find out about our meetings. But the secrecy took its toll on all of us. Jennifer was constantly worried about Marcus discovering our arrangement and using it against her in future custody disputes. Tommy struggled with keeping secrets from his father while also maintaining their relationship. I felt guilty about potentially creating problems for Jennifer and Tommy, while also being grateful for any contact with my grandson. The situation came to a head 8 months later when Tommy accidentally mentioned something about our visits during a phone call with Marcus. He'd been telling his father about a school project on family history, and had referenced something I'd told him about his grandfather's military service. Marcus immediately realized that Tommy had been seeing me, and demanded to know how and when these visits had been occurring. Jennifer called me that evening, her voice tight with stress and fear. "He knows, Ruth. Marcus figured out that Tommy's been seeing you during my custody time, and he's threatening to take me back to court for violating the custody agreement." He says I've been poisoning Tommy against him and exposing him to your unstable influence. The threat was serious because custody agreements typically included provisions about making major decisions jointly, and Marcus could argue that allowing Tommy to see me, despite his objections, constituted a violation of their co-parenting arrangement. If he could convince a judge that Jennifer had acted unilaterally against Tommy's best interests, she could potentially lose custody time or face other legal sanctions. "I'm so sorry," I told Jennifer. "I never wanted to create problems for you or Tommy. Maybe we should stop the visits until things calm down." "No," Jennifer said with surprising firmness. "That's exactly what Marcus wants. To use legal threats to control everyone's behavior and relationships. Tommy needs his grandmother, and you've done nothing wrong by maintaining a relationship with your grandson. If Marcus wants to take me to court over this, then we'll have to fight it out legally." What followed was another round of legal proceedings, this time focused on Tommy's best interests rather than my competency. Marcus petitioned the family court to modify the custody agreement to specifically prohibit Jennifer from facilitating contact between Tommy and me. He argued that I was a disruptive influence who had already demonstrated poor judgment and vindictive behavior, and that Tommy's relationship with me was harmful to his emotional development. Jennifer's attorney countered with evidence of Tommy's improved behavior and emotional well-being since our visits had resumed, along with expert testimony about the importance of extended family relationships for children navigating family transitions. Patricia Valdez provided documentation of my volunteer work and community involvement, evidence that I was a stable, productive member of society rather than the dangerous influence Marcus portrayed. The hearing was more emotionally difficult than my guardianship case had been because it focused on Tommy's welfare rather than my rights. Watching my son argue that my grandson would be better off without me in his life was devastating in ways that his attempts to control my finances and living situation hadn't been. This wasn't just about money or property, it was about love and family bonds and the legacy I'd hoped to pass on to future generations. The family court judge was a father himself, someone who understood both the importance of parental authority and the value of extended family relationships. He listened carefully to both sides' arguments but seemed particularly interested in Tommy's own feelings about the situation. In a private interview with the court-appointed child advocate, Tommy was apparently very clear about his desire to maintain a relationship with me. He described our visits as happy times that helped him feel connected to his grandfather's memory and his family history. He acknowledged that his father was angry about the visits, but said he didn't understand why, since I'd never said anything negative about Marcus or tried to turn Tommy against him. The judge's decision was nuanced and thoughtful. He declined to prohibit contact between Tommy and me, noting that such relationships were generally beneficial for children unless there was clear evidence of harm. However, he also emphasized the importance of co-parental cooperation and ordered that any future contact between Tommy and me should be with the knowledge and consent of both parents. This meant that Marcus retained the right to refuse to allow visits, but he could no longer prevent Jennifer from facilitating them during her custody time if she believed they were in Tommy's best interest. The decision essentially maintained the status quo, while making it clear that the court would not automatically defer to one parent's wishes about extended family relationships. Marcus was clearly unhappy with the outcome, but the judge's emphasis on Tommy's well-being made it difficult for him to continue his absolute opposition to our relationship without appearing to prioritize his own anger over his son's needs. Over the following weeks, Jennifer worked to negotiate a compromise that would allow regular, supervised contact between Tommy and me, while respecting Marcus's concerns about the situation. What emerged was a structured arrangement that felt overly formal for a grandmother-grandson relationship, but was better than no contact at all. Tommy could visit me twice a month for supervised visits that Jennifer would facilitate and attend. Marcus would be informed about these visits in advance and could object if he had specific concerns about timing or activities, but he couldn't veto them entirely without cause. The arrangement wasn't ideal for anyone, but it represented a workable compromise that prioritized Tommy's needs over the adults' conflicted feelings. Tommy got to maintain his relationship with his grandmother, Jennifer got to support that relationship without risking her custody rights, and Marcus got the assurance that the visits would be supervised and transparent. For me, the structured visits felt both wonderful and artificial. Having Jennifer present during my time with Tommy changed the dynamic of our relationship, making conversations more careful and activities more planned. We couldn't have the spontaneous, intimate moments that had characterized our previous relationship, and I couldn't provide the kind of unconditional sanctuary that grandparents traditionally offered their grandchildren. But gradually, the arrangement began to work. Marcus's fears about my negative influence proved unfounded, as Tommy continued to thrive academically and socially while maintaining regular contact with me. Jennifer's presence during visits actually helped facilitate better communication between all the adults involved, as she could witness firsthand that I respected appropriate boundaries and never spoke negatively about Marcus to Tommy. Most importantly, Tommy began to relax into a new normal that included his grandmother without requiring secrecy or divided loyalties. He could talk about our visits with his father without fear of punishment, and he could enjoy our time together without worrying about creating problems for the adults he loved. The healing process was slow and incomplete, but it was genuine. Marcus never apologized for his attempts to control my life and assets, and I never forgave him completely for the betrayal of trust his actions represented. But we learned to coexist in Tommy's life without actively undermining each other, which was perhaps the best outcome we could realistically expect. 2 years later, I received a phone call that changed everything once again. Marcus had been offered a job opportunity in another state, a position that would significantly improve his financial situation, but would require relocating Tommy far from me and from Jennifer's extended family. The decision forced Marcus to confront the reality that his anger toward me was affecting Tommy's access to important family relationships. In a conversation that felt both awkward and necessary, Marcus finally acknowledged that his attempts to isolate Tommy from me had been motivated more by his own hurt and pride than by genuine concerns about Tommy's well-being. He didn't apologize directly for the guardianship scheme or his financial motivations, but he admitted that his handling of our family conflict had been imperfect, and that Tommy had suffered as a result. "I want him to know his family history," Marcus said during that difficult conversation. "I want him to have roots and connections and stories about where he comes from. I can't give him that by myself, and I can't replace what you mean to him just because I'm angry about how things went between us." It wasn't the full accountability I might have hoped for, but it was recognition that his actions had harmed Tommy and that our relationship had value beyond Marcus's personal feelings about me. He agreed to maintain Tommy's contact with me even after the move, including regular video calls and extended visits during school holidays. The new arrangement meant that Tommy and I had fewer opportunities for regular contact, but the time we did have together became more intentional and precious. Tommy would spend 2 weeks with me each summer and a week during winter break, concentrated doses of grandmother-grandson time that allowed us to maintain our bond despite the physical distance. These extended visits also gave me opportunities to share family history and values in deeper ways than had been possible during the shorter, supervised meetings. Tommy learned about his grandfather's military service and my family's immigration story. He helped me tend the garden his grandfather had planted and learned to cook the recipes that connected him to his cultural heritage. He heard stories about his father's childhood that helped him understand Marcus as a whole person, rather than just a source of conflict and disappointment. Most importantly, Tommy began to understand that families could survive serious conflicts and still love each other, that adults could make mistakes without being entirely bad people, and that relationships could be repaired even when they couldn't be fully restored to their original state. These were valuable lessons for a child who had witnessed considerable family dysfunction and would need resilience skills for his own future relationships. As Tommy grew older and more mature, he began to ask more sophisticated questions about the conflicts between his father and me. I tried to answer honestly while still respecting his relationship with Marcus and avoiding unnecessarily damaging revelations. Tommy knew that his father had tried to make legal decisions about my life that I hadn't agreed with, and he understood that money and property had been involved in our disagreement. But he didn't need to know the full extent of Marcus's manipulative behavior or my fears about his true motives. By the time Tommy reached his teenage years, he had developed his own perspective on our family situation that was remarkably mature and balanced. He loved his father and understood that Marcus had been dealing with serious stress and challenges during the period when he'd made his worst decisions. But he also understood that I had been right to protect myself legally, and that his father's actions had been harmful to everyone involved. I think Dad was scared. Tommy told me during one of our summer visits when he was 15. Scared about money and taking care of me by himself and proving he could handle everything. And when people get scared, sometimes they do things they wouldn't normally do. Things that hurt other people even when they don't mean to. His insight was remarkably sophisticated for a teenager, but it also reflected years of processing family trauma and learning to understand complex adult motivations. Tommy had developed empathy for his father's situation while still maintaining clear boundaries about acceptable behavior, a balance that many adults struggle to achieve. "Do you think he would do something like that again?" Tommy asked. "If he got scared enough about something else?" It was a question I'd wondered about myself, but had never articulated directly. Had Marcus's behavior during the guardianship crisis been an aberration brought on by specific circumstances, or had it revealed fundamental aspects of his character that could resurface under different pressures? "I think your father learned some important lessons from what happened," I said carefully. "I think he understands now that trying to control other people's lives, even when you think it's for their own good, usually causes more problems than it solves. And I think he's seen how much it hurt you to have our family torn apart by adult conflicts." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "I hope so. Because I don't want to have to choose sides again if something like that happens when I'm older and have my own family to worry about." His comment revealed both wisdom and worry that no teenager should have to carry. Tommy had learned valuable lessons about family loyalty and personal integrity, but he'd also learned to be cautious about trusting even the people he loved most. Those were protective skills that might serve him well in future relationships, but they represented a loss of innocence that couldn't be completely recovered. Now, 5 years after Marcus first announced his plan to institutionalize me for my own good, our family has found a workable equilibrium that acknowledges past hurts while prioritizing current relationships. Marcus and I are civil to each other during family events and cooperative about decisions that affect Tommy, but we're not close in the way we once were. The fundamental trust between parent and adult child has been damaged in ways that probably can't be fully repaired. But Tommy has thrived despite the family turmoil he witnessed and experienced. He's developed into a thoughtful, ethical young man who values family relationships while understanding their limitations. He's close to both his parents and to me, but he's also learned to maintain appropriate boundaries and to recognize manipulative behavior when he encounters it. Perhaps most importantly, Tommy has learned that standing up for yourself and protecting your rights isn't selfish or vindictive, even when it creates conflict with people you love. He watched me refuse to surrender my autonomy despite family pressure, and he saw that principled resistance to manipulation was possible even in emotionally complex situations. The legal protections Patricia and I put in place remain active, and I continue to volunteer with seniors facing similar family exploitation situations. The work has given me purpose and community while helping me process my own experiences in productive ways. I've discovered that surviving family betrayal and emerging stronger can be a form of service to others facing similar challenges. My house remains my home, my finances remain under my control, and my medical decisions remain my own to make. At 78, I'm still independent, still engaged with my community, still capable of making complex decisions about my own life. The future Marcus painted of inevitable decline in institutional care has not materialized, and may never materialize in the way he predicted. Tommy visits regularly, calls frequently, and includes me in his important life decisions. He's applying to colleges now, and he asks for my perspective on his options along with his parents' input. He values the family history and cultural knowledge I can share, and he's committed to maintaining our relationship as he moves into adulthood. The crisis that began with Tommy's frightened confession about his father's deadly plan ultimately strengthened some family bonds while permanently altering others. We lost the easy trust and assumed loyalty that had characterized our family relationships, but we gained a more realistic understanding of each other's capabilities and limitations. We learned that love alone isn't enough to prevent family members from harming each other, but that love combined with clear boundaries and legal protections can preserve important relationships, even after serious betrayals. Most importantly, we learned that standing up for yourself isn't the same as giving up on family, and that protecting your own rights and dignity can ultimately protect the people you love from having to live with the consequences of your victimization. Tommy didn't need a father who had successfully manipulated his grandmother out of her home and assets. He needed adults who modeled integrity and appropriate boundaries even when those qualities created short-term conflict. The story that began with a child's tears about his grandmother being taken away has become a story about the importance of fighting for your right to stay, to remain present in the lives of the people who matter to you, and to age with dignity on your own terms. It's a story about the difference between helping and controlling, between protecting and manipulating, between loving and possessing. And it's a story that continues to unfold as Tommy grows into the kind of man who will face his own challenges with the tools he learned from watching the adults in his life navigate crisis with varying degrees of wisdom and integrity. The deadly plan his father once had for his grandmother's future became instead a lesson in resilience, resistance, and the enduring power of speaking truth, even when that truth is difficult for the people you love to hear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.